Fairhaven Plantation, which is 17 miles northwest of Charleston, South Carolina, had something strange happen between 1847 and 1862. Records show that not a single enslaved woman from this estate ever tried to escape, even though the Underground Railroad ran through the South and helped thousands of people escape to freedom, not a single one. During that time, newspaper ads and county records showed that 12 men from the property had run away. The Charleston Mercury put out notices asking for their capture. There was a reward posted. But all of the women stayed. What makes this even worse is that auction records show that women sold from Fairhaven went for 2 to 3 times more than similar sales in other parts of South Carolina. Bills of sale used strange words to describe them, like superior breeding stock, proven bloodline, and guaranteed fertility. Records kept by the Charleston Historical Society show that there were systematic notes next to each woman's name, including numbers, dates, and detailed physical descriptions that looked more like livestock inventories than human records. This pattern went on without a break for 15 years, until a doctor from Philadelphia found out what was hidden under the plantation's eastern tobacco barn. Several of Charleston's most powerful families had paid a lot of money to keep this secret. Let's find out what really happened in those fields outside of Charleston now. It wasn't escaped slaves or abolitionist investigations that led to the discovery that would eventually bring Fairhaven to light. It was something much more ordinary. A property dispute over inheritance in 1862. Fairhaven Plantation covered 800 acres of prime low-country land. Its fields grew Sea Island cotton, which sold for high prices in European markets. The Rutledge family had owned the estate since 1791, and it had been passed down from father to son for 3 generations. By the 1842nd, Thomas Rutledge III was in charge of it. He was a quiet man who lived a simple life, which was very different from the flashy wealth of nearby planters. He went to church every week at Street. Phillips in Charleston served on civic committees and was known for running what people in the area called a well-organized business. The plantation had about 60 enslaved people, which is a small number for an estate of its size. Fairhaven's population was what made it different, though. The census records from 1850 show an unusual ratio of 38 women and girls to 22 men and boys. Most plantations kept about the same number of workers, but sometimes they preferred men for heavy work in the fields. Fairhaven's numbers turned this around completely. The property had the main house, which was a simple 2-story building without the big columns and wide verandas of other estates. It also had 2 big tobacco barns, a cotton gin house, a few storage buildings, and the quarters where enslaved people lived. The eastern tobacco barn, which was built in 1843, was much bigger than it needed to be for an estate that mostly grew cotton. People in the area sometimes talked about this strange thing, but Thomas Rutledge said it was to get ready to grow different crops in case cotton prices went down. From the outside, the enslaved people at Fairhaven lived in conditions that looked like those on other low-country plantations. They worked in the fields during the planting and harvest seasons, kept the grounds clean, and did housework. But Fairhaven was different because of a few small things that were hard to see unless you were really paying attention. First, the women at Fairhaven seemed to be in better health than those who lived on nearby estates. People who came by sometimes said something about this. Second, some women seemed to have less work to do than expected, staying closer to the quarters instead of working in fields far away. Third, and most strangely, Fairhaven often sold young children at auction, usually between the ages of 2 and 4, but it still had a lot of adult women living there. To keep things stable and stop unrest, most plantations kept families together when they could. Thomas Rutledge regularly separated mothers from their children in a bureaucratic way. Dr. Samuel Brennan, a doctor from Philadelphia who moved to Charleston in 1858, was one person who saw these patterns. Brennan came from a well-known Quaker family that was against slavery. He kept these opinions to himself, but his medical practice in Charleston served wealthy clients, and he quickly gained access to high society. From this position, he could see things that might have gone unnoticed otherwise. Brennan first heard about Fairhaven's strange reputation in late 1859 when he went to an estate sale in Charleston where a number of enslaved people were being sold. One of them was a young woman, about 20 years old, who was sold from Fairhaven Plantation. The auctioneer talked about her in a way that made Brennan uncomfortable. It wasn't just the usual dehumanizing language that goes along with these kinds of sales. It was also specific terms that suggested selective breeding. The auctioneer said, 5 successful births, excellent physical condition, trained in Fairhaven. The bidding reached an incredible $1,400. In comparison, prime field hands usually went for between $800 and $1,000. Women who were mostly valued for their ability to do housework and have children usually cost less. But this woman, who was sold specifically because of her reproductive history, got almost twice the normal price. Brennan saw a buyer from a Savannah plantation make the deal. After the auction, he quietly asked other doctors who were there about Fairhaven's reputation. He was very upset by what he learned. One doctor said over brandy, "Rutledge runs a specialized operation, improves the stock, if you know what I mean, keeps detailed records. His women are guaranteed to be fertile, have strong bodies, and have few problems. He's been doing it for years." Another doctor said, "Several prominent families invest in his operation. They order specific traits, and he delivers." Brennan asked for more information, but the conversation moved on. He had learned enough to know that something was going on at Fairhaven that was organized and supported by the wealthy people in Charleston. Brennan asked a lot of questions over the next few months. He looked through auction records at the courthouse and took note of trends. Fairhaven sold 47 kids at auction between 1,847 and 1,860. All of them were between the ages of 2 and 5. During the same time, the plantation sold 19 women, all of whom were described in similar ways in terms of their health and ability to have children. The prices they asked for were always much higher than what the market was willing to pay, between $1,200 and $1,600. He also found something else in the records. Fairhaven didn't buy slaves at auction very often. The plantation's population stayed the same because of births, but sales sometimes lowered the numbers. This was not normal. Most plantations hired extra workers on a regular basis, especially since children were usually kept instead of sold young. Brennan had only read about systematic breeding operations in abolitionist literature from the North. These operations treated people like livestock and tried to improve them through selective reproduction. Even though these kinds of things happened all over the South, they weren't talked about openly very often, and they almost never worked with this level of organization and record-keeping. Brennan's medical training made him aware of the new pseudo-scientific ideas about heredity and how to make people better. These ideas would later come together to form the eugenics movement, but they were already being talked about in some academic and medical circles. He knew that some rich people in the South were interested in these ideas because they thought they could use them to justify slavery and make money. But knowing that it was theoretically possible was different from facing the reality of making it happen. Brennan needed proof, not just trends in public records. He had to see how Fairhaven worked in person. The chance came in the beginning of 1862. The Civil War started to affect normal plantation operations, and Thomas Rutledge III died in October 1861. His son, James Rutledge, who was an officer in the Confederate Army, inherited the estate. An overseer named Harold Gaines was in charge of the plantation for a short time. He didn't have the same connections or judgment as the Rutledge family. Brennan found out that Gaines was quietly looking for buyers for some of Fairhaven's slaves in order to make money to keep the estate running while James Rutledge was away at war. This gave Brennan the reason he needed. He would go to Fairhaven pretending to be a buyer and say that he was representing a group of Mississippi planters who wanted to buy proven breeding stock to help them rebuild their own businesses. He told Gaines that he was interested and gave him references from Charleston merchants who knew him as a good businessman. Gaines, who wanted to make sales in the unstable wartime economy, invited the man to come to Fairhaven and look at the women who were available there. Brennan rode northwest from Charleston on the Ashley River Road on the 14th of March, 1862, following directions to Fairhaven Plantation. It was cloudy and humid, which is normal for early spring in the Low Country. He saw the fields as he got closer to the property. Some were planted with early cotton, and others were empty. The main house looked well kept but plain, not as grand as he had expected for a business that made so much money. Gaines met him at the main house. He was a rough man in his 40s who was surprisingly honest about how he ran the business. He said, "You're interested in the breeding operation, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. I can show you the stock, the records, everything. Mr. Rutledge kept very detailed records. You won't find better quality anywhere in the South." They walked across the property to the Eastern Tobacco Barn. Brennan stayed in his role as a curious buyer, asking about health management, productivity, and prices. Gaines answered right away, showing that he was used to getting questions like this from rich clients. Mr. Rutledge started the program in 1847. Gaines said as they walked, he read about improving crops, breeding cattle, and improving sheep. He realized that the same ideas could be used to make better slaves. He started with 6 women of prime age and strong constitution and kept careful records of each birth, tracking which combinations worked best. The way Gaines talked about this, as if it were about crop rotation or livestock management, made Brennan's stomach turn, but he kept his cool. They got to the tobacco barn, which was a big building with a peaked roof and weathered wood siding. Gaines made a key and used it to open the front door. At first, the inside of the barn looked normal, with the usual layout for storing tobacco, including hanging racks and sorting tables. Gaines, on the other hand, took Brennan to the back corner, where there was another door with a big lock. Gaines unlocked this second door and said, "The program runs here. Most people never see this part. Mr. Rutledge only showed it to clients he trusted." Beyond the door, wooden stairs led down into the dark. Gaines turned on a lantern and led the way down. Brennan followed, his heart racing as they went down below ground level. This was strange for low-country construction, where high water tables usually made it impossible to build cellars. At the bottom of the stairs, another door led to an underground room that made Brennan suddenly and horrifyingly clear why no women had ever left Fairhaven. The basement was about 40 feet long and 20 feet wide and went under the whole eastern part of the barn. There were separate cells in the space, each about 6 feet square, with wooden walls and barred doors. There were 6 people in the 8 cells. In each one, a woman lay or sat on a simple wooden bed frame with a thin mattress. The air smelled like bodies, dampness, and being stuck. Several small pipes that went up through the barn floor provided ventilation. But what really hit Brennan hard was not the space itself. In the South, before the Civil War, it was common for people to be put in prison cells and kept there. The systematic organization and clinical precision of the operation set this apart. There was a big table along one wall with stacks of leather-bound ledgers on it. A chart with each woman's name, age, and a series of numbers and dates was on the wall above the table. There were medical tools on a shelf to the side, like scales, measuring devices, and examination tools. Gaines pointed to the cells that were full. He said, "These are the current rotation," in a matter-of-fact way. Mr. Rutledge kept between 6 and 8 in the program at any given time. They're brought down when confirmed pregnant, kept here until birth, then returned after recovery. Keeps them healthy, well-fed, protected from fieldwork that might cause complications. Brennan struggled to maintain his composure. "How long do they stay here?" "It depends. Most births are 7 to 9 months apart, which gives the mother time to heal." Mr. Rutledge kept track of everything: diet, exercise, and the best time to give birth. He made a whole system out of it. Very scientific. Gaines spoke with obvious pride in his employer's methods. One of the women in the cells looked at Brennan with empty eyes. It looked like she was in the last few weeks of her pregnancy. Another, younger, sat on her bed with her knees up and stared at the floor. No one said anything. The silence was deep and horrible. Gaines went to the table and opened one of the books. "This is what buyers pay for. Documentation. See here." He pointed to a page filled with neat handwriting. Complete record for each woman. Name, age, physical measurements, birth dates of children, fathers of record, any health issues, feeding schedules, everything. Mr. Rutledge believed documentation was the key to improvement. Track the results, identify successful patterns, replicate them. Brennan forced himself to look at the ledger. There was a picture of a 6-year-old woman named Sarah on the page. There were 8 children listed below her name, along with their birth dates, fathers' names, and notes about their physical traits. Strong constitution, one entry said. Minimal complications. Recommended for continued rotation. The children's names were followed by notes in parentheses that said things like, sold to Harov Est, Savannah, 1,857, or retained for future breeding stock. The clinical language, the systematic record-keeping, and the casual way of treating human lives as inventory were worse than Brennan had thought. This was not just the cruelty that comes with slavery. It was something more planned and organized. Someone had used logic, planning, and writing down what they did to take advantage of human reproduction in a systematic way. Mr. Rutledge kept records going back to the beginning, Gaines said, pulling out an old ledger. Started with 6 women in 1847. Some worked better than others. He refined the selection process. Learned what characteristics produce the most valuable offspring. By the mid-1850s, he had the system perfected. Brennan cleared his throat, trying to keep his voice steady. And the dads? Gaines nodded. Also carefully chosen. Mr. Rutledge kept detailed records on the men, too, though they weren't confined like this. He tracked which pairings produced the best results. Healthy children, strong constitution, desirable physical characteristics. Sometimes he purchased specific men from other plantations if he identified traits he wanted to introduce. The men knew about this program. Some did, some didn't. Mr. Rutledge managed that carefully. Sometimes he'd arrange things naturally. Other times, he'd be more direct, whatever produced results. Gaines spoke as if discussing stud service for horses. Brennan walked slowly down the cells, and his medical training automatically took note of things like poor ventilation, limited space for exercise, and the mental effects of being locked up for a long time. A few of the women looked like they were very far along in their pregnancies. One of them looked younger than the others, maybe 16 or 17. What happens after they give birth? They stay here for 2 weeks, recovery, nursing the infant. Then the child goes to the nursery in the quarters, and the mother returns to light fieldwork until the next pregnancy is confirmed. Usually takes 3 to 4 months, then back here for the duration. And the children are sold at age 2 to 4, when they're old enough to be weaned, but young enough to be moldable for new owners. Mr. Rutledge found this was optimal, gets the best prices, maintains the program's reputation. Some buyers place orders years in advance for children from specific bloodlines. The word bloodlines made Brennan's jaw tighten. 1. Shoud. Gaines looked at one of the ledgers and asked, "How many kids has this program made?" "Let's see. That's 15 years from 1,847 to now. There have been 63 live births sold at auction. Right now, there are 4 babies in the nursery waiting to be sold and 6 in the program." He pointed to the pregnant women in the cells. All healthy, with a documented lineage and guaranteed breeding stock. Brennan made himself ask more questions to keep up the appearance of being a serious buyer. "What prices do these women command when sold?" "The highest we've recorded was $1,600. Sold to a Georgia plantation in 1859. That was Ruth. She's still here, actually." Gaines pointed to one of the cells. 8 successful births. Never a problem. But Mr. Rutledge would rather keep the most productive ones here than sell them. It's better to keep producing than to sell once. "And this operation is only in Fairhaven?" Gaines shrugged. Mr. Rutledge came up with it on his own, but he wasn't the only one with similar ideas. "I know of at least 3 other estates in South Carolina that are running similar programs, and there are more in Georgia and Mississippi. There's a whole network of buyers who look for scientifically bred stock." Mr. Rutledge was just the most organized about it. The fact that this wasn't an isolated operation, but part of a larger network, hit Brennan hard. This wasn't just one person's mistake. There were a lot of people involved in this organized system, including buyers and investors. Who were his main investors? This was the first time Gaines hesitated. "That's private, Mr. First-Time Daminin." Rutledge worked with a number of well-known families who wanted to keep things quiet. They gave him money, and he gave them returns. It was a normal business deal. Brennan didn't ask any more questions because he didn't want to raise suspicions. He had seen more than enough. Now the question was what he could do with this information. They stayed in the underground cell for another 30 minutes, during which time Gaines showed Brennan the feeding schedules, exercise routines, and medical rules that Thomas Rutledge had come up with. Everything was written down, organized, and improved over the years. Rutledge had even written to agricultural scientists at South Carolina College to ask for advice on breeding theory without saying what it was for. The light in the tobacco barn seemed impossibly bright when they finally climbed back up the stairs. Brennan's eyes had to get used to the light. Gaines locked both doors behind them, making sure that the evidence of what was below was safe. Brennan asked about specific women for sale as they walked back to the main house. He was still pretending to be someone else, but his mind was racing with questions about how to reveal what he had found. Gaines gave prices, offered to set up detailed inspections, and promised to send receipts for any purchases. Brennan said, "I need to talk to my co-workers. This is a big investment. I'll let you know within a month." Gaines seemed happy with this answer. They shook hands at the main house, and then Brennan got on his horse to ride back to Charleston. He tried to make sense of what he had seen as Fairhaven faded from view. What bothered him the most was how clinically accurate it was. This wasn't just a quick, crude way to take advantage of someone. It was thought out, planned, and carried out over 15 years with careful records and constant improvements. Thomas Rutledge had used scientific methods to get the best results in human breeding, just like other people had done to improve farming. The financial records would show big profits, a good name that brought in high prices, and a network of rich investors and eager buyers. Rutledge's program worked exactly as it was supposed to in terms of business success. That night, Brennan started writing down everything he'd seen at his home in Charleston. He drew a picture of the underground cell, wrote down the names he had seen in the ledgers, wrote down Gaines's statements, and copied down as much information as he could while it was still fresh in his mind. But just having paperwork wouldn't stop this. It was okay to own slaves. Even though breeding programs weren't talked about much in polite society, they weren't against the law. Some farming magazines had even written about systematic ways to breed slaves, calling it a new way to run a farm. Brennan saw something horrible, inhumane, and morally wrong. But it didn't break any Southern laws. He could tell his abolitionist friends in the North about this, but in March 1862, when the Civil War was getting worse, such news didn't have much of an effect. The Union Army was more interested in military goals than in running individual plantations. Northern newspapers often wrote about the terrible things that happened to slaves, and this would be just one more story in a long list. Brennan knew that the only way to really stop Fairhaven from working was to write down everything about it so well that even after the war and slavery ended, this specific horror would still be clear. People in the future needed to know that things like this had happened, that they had been done with the knowledge of the community, that they had involved well-known families, and that they had been defended as normal business practice. Brennan went back to Fairhaven several more times over the next few weeks, using his cover as a potential buyer to get in. Gaines was happy to have these visits because he wanted to make sales in the unstable wartime economy. Brennan learned more and more each time. Names from the ledgers, information about the network of buyers, and specifics about the investors who had paid for the program's growth. He found out that Thomas Rutledge's system included thorough medical exams, well-planned nutrition plans, scheduled exercise routines, and organized record-keeping that kept track of every woman's reproductive history. Rutledge had written to doctors in Charleston and Columbia to ask for medical advice on how to improve fertility and avoid problems. Some of these doctors had been to Fairhaven, looked at the women, and made suggestions. Brennan didn't know at first how far the network went. Several rich families in Charleston had put money into Fairhaven's program, giving them money in exchange for access to the children it produced. In 1852, a shipping merchant named Crawford paid for the building of the underground cell. Haywood, a banker, had paid for the purchase of several specific men whose physical traits Rutledge wanted to include. Sinclair, who grew rice, had given medical supplies and equipment. These weren't anonymous, far-off investors. These were guys Brennan had met at parties, whose wives went to the same church, and whose kids played in the same parks. They put money into breeding people just like they put money into cotton futures or railroad bonds. In April 1862, Brennan was able to talk to one of the women for a short time while Gaines was busy with something else. He had seen her name in a ledger entry weeks before. It was Sarah. She was 31 years old and had given birth to 8 children in the program, but she couldn't keep any of them after they turned 2. "Why don't you run?" Brennan asked softly, the question that had been bothering him since the start. "The men run. Why don't the women?" Sarah asked, looking at him with tired, resigned eyes. "Where would we go?" she asked. "They tell us that if we run, our babies will die, and they mean it. They've done it." A woman named Rebecca ran in the first year of the program. When they brought her back, her baby was gone. Mr. Rutledge gathered all of us and made sure we understood, you run, your child dies. Every woman here has children somewhere, sold to plantations across the South. We don't know where most of them are, but we're told that if we cause trouble or run, word goes out to those plantations. Our children suffer, so we don't run. We stay. We survive. We hope that someday, somehow, we might see our children again. The psychological control was perfect. The underground cells were only one part of the prison. The real imprisonment was the planned use of children as hostages, tools, and protection against resistance. The women didn't leave because they couldn't imagine how to get away. They stayed because getting away would mean leaving or putting their children in danger. Gaines came back before Brennan could say anything, and the moment was over. But Sarah's words stuck with him. We stay, we survive, we hope. By the end of spring 1862, Brennan had gathered a lot of information about how Fairhaven worked. He had maps, copies of ledger entries, names of investors and buyers, information about the network of similar businesses, and Sarah's own testimony. He had also found a number of Charleston doctors who had given Rutledge medical advice over the years. What should we do with this information? The war was getting worse. In November 1861, Union troops took Port Royal, giving them a base on the South Carolina coast. As the war went on, Charleston would probably have to deal with military pressure. Brennan knew that things might get crazy in the Low Country soon, which could destroy evidence or scatter the people involved. He chose what to do. He would put everything together in a detailed report, have several witnesses he had carefully chosen sign it, and then give copies to trusted people in both Charleston and Philadelphia. No matter how the war ended, this paperwork would still be there. The people who did it could be found. It was possible to name the investors. It was possible to prove the operation was real, not just a rumor or an accusation. Brennan worked on this paperwork all summer in 1862 while still running his medical practice and pretending to be a buyer. In August, he went to Fairhaven for the last time and told Gaines that he had decided not to go through with the purchases because of the uncertainty of the war. Gaines looked disappointed but understood. Many business deals were being canceled because the war's outcome was becoming less clear. Brennan was able to give Sarah a folded piece of paper with his family's address in Philadelphia, his sister's name, and the address of his family's home during this last visit. He said to her in a low voice, "If you make it through this, and if you ever get to the north, find this address. Tell them Samuel Brennan sent you. They'll help you." Sarah took the paper, looked at it for a moment, and then put it away in her clothes. She didn't say anything, but her eyes showed that she might have been grateful or just aware that someone had seen her pain and recorded it. Brennan left Fairhaven for the last time, rode back to Charleston, and finished his paperwork. In September 1862, he sealed several copies of his report in waxed packets and made plans for them to be kept in different places, one with a lawyer in Charleston, one sent to his family in Philadelphia, and one left with a Quaker meeting house in Columbia. After that, he waited to see what the war would bring. The war came to Charleston, slowly at first, then all at once. Union forces kept a naval blockade going, which slowly killed the city's economy. Bombardment started in 1863. By 1865, Charleston's Confederate defenders had left the city because Sherman's army was coming from the west and Union forces were coming from the coast. Brennan, who had kept his medical practice going during the war and treated both Confederate soldiers and civilians, stayed in Charleston until it fell. When Union troops took over the city in February 1865, he quickly went to military officials to tell them about Fairhaven Plantation. The Union Army wasn't interested in looking into what they saw as historical grievances at first, because they were dealing with thousands of newly freed people and the huge logistical challenge of occupation. The end of slavery was near. Until order was restored, justice for past wrongs would have to wait. But Brennan kept going. He got in touch with military doctors, showed them his paperwork, and talked about the medical parts of Rutledge's program. Finally, in March 1865, he got a Union Army captain named Joseph Fuller to go with him to Fairhaven to see if any evidence was still there. They rode northwest from Charleston on a day that felt like spring was coming early. The low country was starting to change from being dormant in the winter to new growth. Brennan saw right away that a lot had changed as they got closer to Fairhaven. The fields weren't being used. One side of the main house had signs of fire damage. The doors of the tobacco barns were open, and the barns were empty. They found Harold Gaines in a small house on the edge of the property. Several families who had been enslaved before had taken over the land. Gaines, who was no longer an overseer but a man trying to make it in the broken economy, told them what had happened. Gaines said, "People started to leave when they heard the war was over. The enslaved people just walked away. Some of the women went down to that underground cell and tore it apart. They wanted to destroy everything, the records, the cell itself. I didn't try to stop them. By then, what did it matter? The ledgers?" Brennan asked. "The paperwork?" "Burned. The women burned everything. All of Mr. Rutledge's records, years of paperwork, all of it. They made a fire right there in the tobacco barn and burned every paper they could find." "What about the women themselves? Sarah? Ruth? The others?" Gaines shrugged. "Most of them left. I heard that some went north with Union soldiers. Others went to different plantations to look for children who had been sold. I don't know what happened to most of them. Captain Fuller wanted to see the underground cell. Gaines took them to the eastern tobacco barn, which is now just a burned-out shell." The door to the basement was open. They went down the stairs. Brennan had never been there before, and Fuller had never been there before. The cell looked just like Brennan remembered it, but it had been destroyed. The doors to each cell had been ripped off their hinges. The table for the exam was turned over. There were ashes in a lot of buckets where papers had been burned. The charts on the walls had been ripped down, and only pieces of them were left. But not everything was lost. Brennan found a ledger that had mostly survived in the rubble. The pages were burned at the edges, but were still readable. It was about the years 1847 to 1852, which were the program's early years. He carefully picked up the damaged book and a few other pieces of paper that hadn't been completely destroyed. Captain Fuller stood in the middle of the underground space, looking at the cells and trying to figure out what had happened there. He asked in a low voice, "How long did this work?" 15 years, Brennan said. "From 1847 to 1862, 63 kids were sold. Many women went through the program. All of it was recorded, organized, and improved over time. And it was legal? Slavery was legal. Breeding programs were legal. Nothing about this broke Southern law at the time." Fuller shook his head slowly. "What kind of men?" "Men who are respected." Brennan cut in. "Prominent Charleston families, church members, and civic leaders. Men who thought they were being innovative by using scientific principles to manage estates. They didn't see any moral issues with any of it. They looked around the rest of the property, but didn't find much more evidence. The people who used to be slaves and now lived in parts of Fairhaven said that most of the women from the breeding program left right after they were freed. Some had gone to the north. Others had gone to Georgia and Alabama plantations to look for children who had been sold years before. Brennan was told by an older woman who had worked in the main house that she remembered Sarah. She left in late February, soon as she heard Sherman's army was coming. Said she was going to find her children. She had an address somewhere up north, piece of paper she'd kept hidden for years. I saw her write down the names of her children before she left. 8 names. Their ages. The plantations where they'd been sold. She was going to find every one of them. Did you know where she went first? Georgia, I think. That's where 2 of her babies were sold. Brennan felt a small measure of satisfaction, knowing Sarah had kept the address he'd given her, had survived until freedom, and was now actively searching for her children. There was still no way to know if she would find them, if they would remember each other after being apart for so long, or if any reunion was even possible. Captain Fuller wrote a report for the military that included Brennan's 3-year-old testimony and the physical evidence of the underground cell. It was about Fairhaven's breeding program. The report was added to a growing collection of documents about the specific horrors of slavery. This was part of a huge project by Union authorities to keep records of the system they had helped destroy. But no one was charged. In 1863, James Rutledge, Thomas Rutledge III's son, died at the Battle of Gettysburg. As an overseer, Harold Gaines was not legally responsible for the policies set by his employers. The investors who had paid for the program, Crawford, Haywood, Sinclair, and others, were wealthy people from Charleston who were trying to figure out how to deal with the problems of Reconstruction. Military leaders decided that going after them would make things even worse. Brennan wanted some kind of accountability, but Union leaders made it clear that their main goal was to rebuild the government, not to punish people for crimes that were legal in the South. One colonel said to him, "Slavery itself was the crime. We've ended slavery. That's the justice available." It wasn't enough. Brennan knew it wasn't enough, but it was all the justice that would be offered. He spent the rest of 1,865 and the beginning of 1,866 inches, Charleston, where he helped newly freed people get medical care and kept writing down what he had learned about Fairhaven and other similar places. He talked to dozens of people who had been enslaved before and wrote down their stories. He found out about at least 4 other breeding programs in South Carolina, as well as a few more in Georgia and Alabama. The network was huge, and Fairhaven was just one part of it. Brennan got a letter at his Charleston address in March 1866. His sister had sent it from Philadelphia and said that a woman had come to their house several months earlier with his address. Sarah was the woman. The rest of the letter was in Sarah's own words. With help from Brennan's sister, she learned to read and write by telling her story from the past year. She had gone to 3 different plantations in Georgia and found 2 of her children. One was 12 and the other was 14. They both forgot about her. Someone had told the younger one that his mother had died. The older one could hardly remember anything before being sold. Sarah had been with them for weeks, trying to reconnect. But in the end, she didn't want to mess up the lives they had built. She left them at their plantations, where they now work as paid workers instead of slaves, and promised to come back. Sarah wrote, "I found 2 of my 8, and I will keep looking for the others. But I wanted you to know I survived. I wanted you to know that what you wrote down is important. Someone wrote down what happened to us. Someone will remember. That matters more than I can say." The letter ended with Sarah's plan to keep looking, going from plantation to plantation and following any leads about children who were sold from Fairhaven between 1,847 and 1,862. Sarah never got back to Brennan. He didn't know if she found her other kids or what happened to her, but her letter made something clear. Proof was important. It was important to record the truth. Witnesses were still useful, even when justice was impossible. Brennan wrote his last report on Fairhaven Plantation in late 1866. It included the extra testimony he had gathered and the physical evidence that had survived. He made several copies and made sure they were stored in archives in Philadelphia, Boston, and Charleston, where they would stay as a record of what happened in history. The report had everything: the names of the investors, a description of the breeding program, diagrams of the underground cell, testimonies from Sarah and other women, financial records showing profits, letters between Thomas Rutledge and different doctors, and a full account of how the system worked for 15 years with the full knowledge of Charleston's elite. He titled the report simply, "Id, Bryth, and Problems." Documentation of systematic human breeding operations at Fairhaven Plantation, Charleston District, South Carolina, 1847 to 1862. In his conclusion, Brennan wrote, "What occurred at Fairhaven was not the aberration of one disturbed individual, but the logical extension of a system that treated human beings as property." Thomas Rutledge did not invent human breeding. He simply systematized it, documented it, and refined it according to principles he believed were scientifically sound. His operation succeeded because slavery made it legal, because wealthy investors made it profitable, and because social structures made it invisible to those who preferred not to see. The women imprisoned in Fairhaven's underground cell were not victims of one man's cruelty, but of an entire society's moral failure. Their suffering was not exceptional within slavery's framework. It was exemplary of the logical conclusions that framework permitted. We must remember not because this was uniquely terrible, but because it was terribly common. Fairhaven was one documented example of a practice that occurred at countless plantations across the South. We cannot prosecute the dead or change the past, but we can ensure that what happened is recorded, remembered, and understood. We can insist that the comfortable fiction of benevolent slavery be confronted with the documented reality of places like Fairhaven. And we can honor the women who survived by refusing to let their suffering be forgotten or minimized. They stayed when they wanted to run. They endured because they had no choice. And now, in freedom, they search for children they were never allowed to keep. That is the legacy of places like Fairhaven, not just the suffering inflicted, but the lives still being lived in its shadow. Brennan deposited his final report in January 1867, then returned to Philadelphia to resume medical practice. He kept writing to people who used to be slaves at Fairhaven, helping some of them find family members and giving medical care when they needed it. But he never went back to Charleston or the plantation itself. Fairhaven stayed empty until the late 1862. During Reconstruction, different families tried to farm parts of the land, but none of them stayed for long. By the 1872, the land had been split up and sold to several people. In 1874, they tore down the main house. Over the next few decades, the tobacco barns slowly fell down. In the 1882, when a new owner tried to build on the site, they filled in the underground cell under the eastern tobacco barn. People who dug up the area said they found pieces of the cells, but most of the building was destroyed or buried. By 1890, there was no sign on the surface of what had been hidden there. Crawford, Haywood, Sinclair, and other families who had put money into Fairhaven's breeding program stayed important in Charleston society during and after the Reconstruction era. None of them ever admitted to being involved. When abolitionist books or historical accounts mentioned Brennan's report, these families said it was Northern propaganda that was blown out of proportion or made up to justify the war and Reconstruction policies. In 1873, a Charleston newspaper printed a letter from James Crawford's son that defended his father's good name and said he had nothing to do with the things that Brennan had written about. The letter said, "These accusations are the bitter lies of those who want to justify their invasion of our homeland. No such program existed. My father was a good businessman who lived with honor his whole life." Other families also denied the claims. The original ledgers were destroyed by the women who had been hurt by the program, and Thomas Rutledge was dead, so there was no clear proof. Brennan's records were thorough, but people who didn't believe them could always say they were biased because they were written by an abolitionist doctor with political goals. After they were freed, the people who used to be slaves in Fairhaven moved all over the country. Most of them blended in with the large group of freed people who were rebuilding their lives after the war. Some, like Sarah, stayed in touch with their northern allies. But most just moved on, trying to build their futures instead of writing about the past. Brennan didn't know, and he couldn't have known in the years right after the war, that some of the children sold from Fairhaven would carry pieces of memory with them that would come back to them decades later. A woman named Clara Hayward, who lived in Atlanta and worked as a seamstress, wrote to the Freedmen's Bureau in 1889 with a strange question. She was looking for information about her birth, which she thought had happened on a plantation near Charleston. She wrote that her first memory was of being taken away from her mother when she was about 3 years old, and a man looking at her teeth and measuring her height before putting her in a wagon. The Freedmen's Bureau sent her letter to a number of people in Charleston, and it eventually got to a church group that had been gathering stories from people who had been enslaved. Someone in that group knew about Brennan's records. They sent Clara a copy of parts of his report and the rest of the broken ledgers he had saved. Clara's response, which is kept in church records, showed Brennan something he hadn't fully thought about. The Fair Haven kids, who are now adults, were starting to look for their roots. "I always knew something was different about how I was sold," Clara wrote. "The plantation where I grew up, the owners would sometimes mention that I came from quality stock, that I'd been purchased specifically for breeding. I never understood what that meant until I read Dr. Brennan's report. Now I understand. I was one of the products of that program. My mother's name was Ruth, according to the records you sent. She gave birth to me in 1856. I have spent my entire life not knowing her, and now I learned she was imprisoned underground, that I was taken from her deliberately as part of a business operation." Clara's letter continued with a request that would occupy the final years of Brennan's life. She wanted to know if anyone knew what happened to Ruth, if she made it through the war, and if there was any chance of finding her. Brennan, who is now in his 62nd and only works part-time, took on Clara's case with the determination of someone who knew this might be his last chance to help her find some peace. He sent letters to every Freedmen's Bureau office in South Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama asking if they had any records of a woman named Ruth who was about 50 years old and had been enslaved at Fair Haven Plantation. He got in touch with church groups, charities, and black community leaders who were helping people who had been enslaved find family members who were spread out. It took almost 2 years to find. Brennan got answers from dozens of people during that time, some of whom had information about women named Ruth. However, none of them matched the specific details from Fair Haven's incomplete records. He found out that Ruth was a common name, that thousands of women had been separated from their children, and that the chances of finding one person in the chaos of post-war migration were very small. 3 months before Brennan died, in March 1891, he got a letter from a minister in Mobile, Alabama, who had heard about the search through a network of black churches. The minister said that Ruth, an old woman, had been a member of his church for a number of years. She didn't talk about her past much, but she did say that she had been held in an underground cell at a plantation near Charleston and that she had 8 children, all of whom were taken from her. Brennan quickly gave Clara the minister's phone number. He never found out if Clara and Ruth got back together. He died in June 1891, before he could read any more letters. But church records in Mobile show that a woman named Clara Hayward came to the city in April 1891 and stayed for 2 weeks. The minister wrote in his diary at the time, "Clara has found her mother. After 35 years apart, they recognized each other right away. Ruth cried for 3 days straight. Clara told me her mother kept saying the same thing. They told me if I ran, my babies would die. So I stayed. I stayed for you." This reunion, one of the few documented successes among Fair Haven's separated families, showed something about the program's long-term effects. Ruth couldn't read the Underground Railroad signals or take advantage of chances to escape because she was completely under psychological control, not because she was physically unable to. For 15 years, she thought that any act of resistance would lead to the deaths of her children. Even after she was freed and learned that slavery was over, she still believed that way of thinking about the world. One of the few first-hand accounts of what it was like to be a product of Fair Haven's breeding program is Clara's letters to the minister, which are kept in the church's archives. "My mother told me that after I was born, she was allowed to nurse me for 2 weeks. Then I was taken to what they called the nursery, and she saw me only occasionally, until I was sold at age 3. She said she tried to memorize everything about me, the shape of my face, a birthmark on my shoulder, the sound of my voice. She was terrified she would forget me. When we met again in Mobile, she looked at my shoulder first thing. The birthmark is still there. She touched it and said, 'I remembered right. I remembered you right.'" The reunion between Clara and Ruth sparked other searches. Word got out through black church networks and community groups that the kids from Fairhaven were looking for their mothers and that there were some incomplete records that might help. At least 6 more people got in touch with different groups between 1,891 and 1,895, saying they were products of Fairhaven's breeding program and looking for family members. Some of these searches worked, but others were disappointing, or ended with the discovery that the person they were looking for had died years earlier. But the searches themselves showed the program's full scope in ways that Brennan's original documents couldn't. The kids who were sold from Fairhaven lived in 7 different states. Plantations from Virginia to Texas had bought them. Some had been sold many times, passing from one owner to the next as property changed hands. To keep track of their movements, we had to put together bits of information from a number of different places, such as auction houses, plantation ledgers, Freedmen's Bureau documents, and church registries. In the middle of the 1,890 seconds, Margaret Thornton, a historian at Atlanta University, became interested in writing down these searches. She had read Brennan's report and knew that Fairhaven was important because it was a documented case study of systematic breeding that could show bigger trends. Thornton interviewed 12 people who said they were Fairhaven products between 1,895 and 1,900. He also talked to 3 women who had been in the breeding program and lived through it. Her research, published in 1901 as a modest academic paper titled Systematic Reproduction and Family Separation, a case study of Fairhaven Plantation, was the first to look at the program's long-term effects in depth. Thornton noted that the survivors had certain psychological patterns, such as constant anxiety, trouble making connections, and nightmares about being separated and locked up. She said that a number of the women who had been in the breeding program never had kids after they were freed, even though they were old enough to have kids when they were freed. Thornton wrote, "The experience of forced reproduction, of having children systematically taken, seems to have created a permanent aversion to pregnancy." Most importantly, Thornton's research showed how big the network was. She found at least 11 other estates in South Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama that had run similar programs between 1,840 and 1,865 by carefully looking at auction records and letters between plantations. Fairhaven wasn't special. It was part of a larger system in which planters shared information about methods, compared results, and even traded enslaved people for breeding purposes. One particularly disturbing finding in Thornton's research was evidence of what she called breeding exchanges. Several plantations, including Fairhaven, had set up temporary transfers of enslaved men to add certain physical traits to their programs. A letter from Thomas Rutledge to a Georgia planter, dated 1857 and preserved in a county archive, discussed such an arrangement. "I am pleased to accept your offer of Jacob for a period of 6 months. His height and build match the specifications we discussed. I anticipate several promising additions to our program from this arrangement. Payment as agreed, $200 for the term, with an additional $50 bonus if results prove satisfactory." The clinical language, the explicit commodification of human reproduction, the casual coordination between planters, all of this confirmed that Fairhaven represented not an aberration, but a business model that multiple operations had adopted. Thornton's paper didn't get much attention when it came out. In 1901, when national attention was on other things and many Southern historians were actively promoting stories that downplayed the brutality of slavery, there wasn't much academic interest in how slavery worked. The few reviews her work got said it was too exaggerated or brought up painful memories that should have been left alone. Thornton's research, on the other hand, was widely known in black communities, especially in the South. It confirmed stories that had been told for a long time but were not often believed by people who weren't there. Families that had heard about breeding programs but had been told they were myths or exaggerations now had proof that these programs existed and worked just as they remembered. The paper also gave out names. Thornton had written down the names of the investors who paid for Fairhaven and other programs like it: Crawford, Haywood, Sinclair, and a few others. These families, who still live in Charleston and other southern cities, were shocked to learn that their ancestors were involved in systematic breeding operations. The answer came quickly, and was not friendly. In 1902, descendants of the families that Thornton studied put pressure on Atlanta University to disavow her work. The university, which relied on donations from people, including those from the South, said that Thornton's research was poorly substantiated and that it did not meet academic standards. Thornton herself had to deal with serious professional problems. She lost her job as a teacher and had a hard time finding work in academia after that. But there was proof. There was a report from Brennan. There were ledgers that were broken up. There were testimonies from people who lived through it. And more, the kids who had been through these programs were talking about their experiences in public, refusing to let the past be forgotten or downplayed. One of these voices was Samuel Crawford, who, ironically, shares a last name with one of Fairhaven's investors but is not related to him. Crawford was born in Fairhaven in 1859 and sold to a plantation in Mississippi when he was 3. He later became a minister and community organizer in Jackson. He wrote a short memoir called Born for Sale: My Life as a Product of Systematic Breeding in 1903. The memoir talked about his childhood on a plantation in Mississippi, where he was told over and over again that he came from superior stock and that he should have children who could be sold for a lot of money. Crawford wrote, "I was not raised to be a person. I was raised to be a product. My value was assessed by my physical characteristics, my health, my potential for reproduction. When I was old enough to understand what had been done to my mother, imprisoned underground, forced to bear children for profit, I felt rage that took years to transform into anything productive. This rage drives my work now. I tell my story because I want people to understand that systematic breeding was not some vague historical abstraction. It happened to real people. It happened to my mother. It happened to me. And the people who designed and profited from these programs were not monsters. They were respectable citizens who saw nothing wrong with what they were doing." Crawford's memoir sold modestly, but reached important audiences. Copies were passed around to black churches, schools, and early civil rights groups. More importantly, it made other Fairhaven products want to tell their stories. Between 1903 and 1910, at least 8 published accounts came out from people who said they were children sold from Fairhaven or similar breeding programs. Some of these were short newspaper articles, while others were parts of longer memoirs. All of these stories had similar themes: the lifelong fight to figure out where they came from, the mental toll of finding out they were the result of systematic breeding, the trouble of finding family members, and the anger at seeing the people who did it and their descendants not face any consequences. Several authors pointed out the bitter irony that the families who made money from breeding programs stayed rich and respected, while the victims and their children lived with the trauma for the rest of their lives. By 1910, there was enough evidence to show that Fairhaven's breeding program was not just abolitionist propaganda or an exaggeration of history. Several independent sources corroborated the fundamental facts: an underground cell, systematic breeding over a span of 15 years, meticulous record-keeping, participation of prominent Charleston families, the sale of 63 children, and a network of analogous operations across the South. Yet this documentation prompted no legal action, no official acknowledgement, no institutional response. The families who were named as investors denied everything or said that their ancestors had been misled about what the program was really about. Southern historical societies either ignored the evidence or tried to hide it. In the early 1900s, there wasn't much interest in looking into the specific ways that slavery worked. By 1910, there was a growing collection of testimonies from survivors like Ruth and Sarah, from people who were part of the program like Clara and Samuel Crawford, and from investigators like Brennan and Thornton. This archive recorded not only the events at Fairhaven, but also the reasons behind them, the way it worked, the people who benefited from it, and the lasting effects it had on those who went through it. The archive also recorded something else: resistance. The women who destroyed Fairhaven's records in 1865 didn't just want to get rid of the proof. They wanted to take back control of their own stories by destroying the ledgers that kept track of their bodies, pregnancies, and children like they were goods. They were saying that their lives were not just numbers in someone else's system, but, ironically, The survival of incomplete records made it possible for families to get back together later, for searches to bring families back together, and for documentation to prove experiences and make them impossible to deny. The conflict between the desire to obliterate all evidence and the necessity to retain certain evidence for accountability persisted unresolved. Ruth's last letter to Clara, written in 1897, 6 years after they got back together, shows this tension. Ruth lived in Mobile and was getting weaker and weaker, knowing she wouldn't live much longer. She wrote, "I'm glad, Doctor." Brennan wrote down what happened. "I'm glad those bits of record survived. Without them, you wouldn't have been able to find me. But I also understand why we burned everything we could reach. We wanted those men to lose their precious data and have their systematic plans destroyed. We wanted to take something from them, like they took everything from us. I still feel both things. Grateful the evidence exists, and grateful we destroyed what we could. Both can be true." Ruth died in 1899, at about 70 years old. She had been in Fairhaven's breeding program for 15 years, looking for her kids for 22 years, and living with Clara for 8 years before she died. Clara made arrangements for her burial in Mobile. The headstone read, "Ruth, mother of 8. She stayed because she had no choice." The women who went through Fairhaven's breeding program did not leave any written records of their own. We only know their names from the records kept by their oppressors, like ledgers, sales records, and Brennan's report. Their own voices, their own views, and their own understanding of what happened to them were never recorded and can never be found again. From the documents that survived, we can learn that Fairhaven Plantation ran a systematic human breeding program from 1847 to 1862. This program was funded by wealthy families in Charleston, and it produced at least 63 children who were sold at auction. The women in the program did not run away because they were told their children would be killed if they did. We know that when Union troops took over Charleston, the women who had been held in that underground cell destroyed all the records they could find. We know that at least one woman, Sarah, made it to freedom and spent years looking for the 8 children who had been taken from her. We can also be sure that Samuel Brennan, a doctor from Philadelphia, wrote down what he saw because he thought it was important to record the truth, even if it was impossible to get justice. The secret room below Fairhaven's tobacco barn is no longer there. The plantation is gone, and the land has been divided up and built on. There is no sign that shows where the breeding program took place. There is no memorial for the women who were held there. The only proof that is still around is in archives, in Brennan's report, and in the broken ledgers he saved from being thrown away. This is what really happened at Fairhaven Plantation from 1847 to 1862. It wasn't a rumor or a legend. It was a documented fact. It was a system that treated human reproduction like farming, separated mothers from their children with bureaucratic efficiency, and operated openly with the financial support of Charleston's elite. The women who lived didn't leave any last wills. They didn't write memoirs or talk to the press for the future. When freedom came, they just walked away and tried to put their lives back together after they had been systematically destroyed. Some people found their kids. A lot of people didn't. Each of them had to deal with what had been done to them, what had been taken from them, and what could never be fixed. That burden didn't end with emancipation. It lasted for generations. From the kids who grew up without their mothers, to the mothers who spent decades looking for them, to the families that never got back together, to all the invisible scars that systematic breeding programs left on people, families, and communities. This is how systematic human breeding worked in real life. When planters talked about improving stock and scientific management, this is what they meant. The euphemisms and abstractions were based in reality. Real women were kept underground, away from their children, and controlled through threats and manipulation. They were treated as production units in a profit-making operation that lasted 15 years and was seen as morally and legally acceptable by the society that allowed it. Fairhaven wasn't the only one. It was just one of the examples that had been written down. How many other plantations ran programs like this? How many other women were imprisoned in the same way? How many kids were taken away from their mothers so that they could be bred for profit? We will never know the full extent because most operations didn't keep records. Their records were lost, or they just weren't looked into and recorded the way Brennan did Fairhaven. We only have this one story, this one plantation, and these women whose names we only know from their oppressors' records. We also know that something terrible happened in the Low Country outside of Charleston for 15 years with full social acceptance. The women who lived through it destroyed every record they could find when it was over. They didn't want to remember what had happened to them, except for what Samuel Brennan saved, what he wrote down, and what is still in archives, testimony that someone saw, recorded, and kept. And now you know it too. You know that Fairhaven was real. You know what went on there. You know that no woman ever ran away. And you know why. You know that a lot of kids were sold at auction, away from their mothers, and sent all over the South. You know that well-known families put money into this program and made money from it. You know that the women looked for their kids after they got free. You know that one woman looked for years. You also know that most of the women who went through this are now lost to history, with their full stories never being told and only they knowing what they went through. This is the truth that records keep. Not fair. Fairhaven's victims did not get justice, not fixing it. It was impossible to get back what was taken. Just documentation, just the record that this happened, just the insistence that it be remembered rather than forgotten.